Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'll have a chance to talk about my project here at the Institute. It focused on Hellenistic historiography and how philosophical concepts and ideas may have influenced historical writing in the Hellenistic period. We have two of the main questions on the slide. When I first formulated this project years ago, what comes to mind is a work by John Marinkola from 1997 on authority and tradition, now reissued actually in a new version last year. He points out quite rightly that historians had a double vision. They were constantly connecting themselves to conventions and traditions back in time, but at the same time they were aiming to create new and superior historiographical positions, sort of a constant process of contrasting continuity. And authors needed to take sides in what approach, purpose, orientation, and vision of the world that they want to describe. And to my mind, this has a lot to do with emotions, because this double vision made authors appeal to the audience to persuade. The strategy was to arouse the audience emotionally, and this was done by creating a vivid and emotional descriptions to convince the audience of a specific interpretation of the past. So emotion is in no way inappropriate in history. In fact, all good historians used emotion. And it was a fundamental aspect of ancient historiography, both as a cause of historical events and as an aspect of the presentation and reception of historical narratives. Thus, we have no other choice, I think, than to try to reconstruct the emotion behind the sources, as texts either directly or indirectly originate in emotions, reveal emotions, or seek to arouse emotions. And this was sort of my starting point for this project. This leads me to the structure of my lecture. It has two parts. One part, the first part, that concentrates on the importance of emotions in Polybios and how they sort of are tied to its concept of universal history, which includes some examples from Book 3 and 6 about the causes of the Second Punic War, and this theory he has in Book 6 about constitutional change, the anarchicrosis. The second part will be about biographical writing in the early part of the Hellenistic period, because I think they sort of applied some of the same techniques and approaches as we see in historiography, sort of trying to tie these two things together. Okay, but let's start with Polybios, because he's going to have a really pivotal central point in my lecture. He wrote an historical account in the 2nd century during the awakening of Roman imperialism and sets out with the objective to explain the successful appearance of a new world empire. In the opening lines of his work, he stated his main purpose, to examining how the Romans were able to take the world in only 53 years. And this passage you can see shows that it was the Roman conquest from 220 to 167 that created the need for an account that could explain the causes and consequences of this new unique empire. And it underlines that Polybios was really much shaped by the political realities, that is, the growing importance of the West, as his objective was to explain how a small Hellenistic city-state transformed itself into a world empire. Of ancient historians, Polybios was probably the one that most passionately criticized emotions. He pointed directly to several of his historiographic predecessors for writing overly emotional, claiming that they fabricated or exaggerated facts without giving due attention to causes. And this critique has secured Polybios' reputation as a pragmatic historian and aligned him with modern approaches to historical writing. All this in opposition to the use of emotions. We have some examples here on the slide. For example, Arthur Eckstein has noted that Polybios used emotions and did demonstrate a concern for morality, but he never really situates emotion itself in that relation. The Champion has shown how Polybios described other people than the Romans as uncivilized and passionate, but he never completely addresses how emotions could form motivations and concrete actions. Recently, Lisa Howe has examined how Polybius' didacticism results from moral behavior, but again, the importance of emotion seems to be absent in the analysis. Last year, Regina Lord took a great step forward in placing emotion in its own right, but I think more can be done to sort of tie this approach more directly to Polybius' concept of universal history. So I think these interpretations can be advanced, and I would propose that Polybius provides an important perspective into how emotion could be applied in historiography. This connection was more fundamental than Herodotus, Thucydides, and Xenophon. It seems to organize and structure his conceptualization in at least three areas. First, in a didactic aim, in applying emotions to the study of the past, especially in the examination of why people do what they do. Polybius challenged the reader to consider their own emotional reactions appropriately, so they could learn from and apply other people's experiences to their own lives. Second, in the way emotions created collective identity. According to Polybius, emotions interacted between different individuals and groups, and the people as a collective community could react rationally with anger, hatred, and resentment. And collective emotions could explain reactions towards something, for example, the Roman Empire, or it could cause constitutional change within the state. And the third point, causal analysis, and specifically in relation to universal history. Polybius used emotions as a pivotal element in causation and as a bridge between events, action, and moral principles. He used emotions to examining human nature, and it connected historical events and motivated and justified actions. And I think this must inform our understanding of Polybius' historiographical project. And I now want to try to qualify that with some concrete examples, starting with Polybius' idea of universal history and how emotions lay at the very heart of his idea of causation and interconnections. In a passage, we have a map here. Polybius' historiographical understanding was different from earlier writing in its literary and intellectual manifestations. It was new in the sense that he pointed to a specific Olympiad in which time and space began to sort of coordinate, and events were destined to move towards the same end. And that was the manifestation of Rome's superiority over the rest of the world. You can see I've plotted these 7 new leaders on the map. It's one of the arguments that Polybius is using. He's sort of pointing to the fact that in these years we get this complete transformation of leaders coming into power, to sort of underlining his idea of this Olympiad, and that this Olympiad is sort of the point in history where we get these interconnections. In a passage from Book 5, Polybius saw history as a process that came into being at a specific point in history, when it was possible to understand all events inside an universalistic framework. And he pinpoints the emergence of this new world to the 3rd year of the 140th Olympiad, at a specific conference at Naupactus. And this is where the affairs of Greece, Italy, and Africa first became interconnected. And it meant that all eyes, or the eyes of all, according to Polybius, sort of now turned to the issues in Italy. And the historical context here is 3 specific events that symbolize the world evolving into a unified whole: the social war on Peloponnese between the Aetolians and Achaeans, the Fourth Syrian War between Antiochus and Ptolemy, and the Second Punic War between Rome and Carthage. And with the former 2 concluded in 217, the shape of the world had changed fundamentally. And from this point on, and this is the grounding principle in Polybius' approach, history could only be understood by relating different regions into a broader framework. I think the first event he's pointing to, the war between Philip the Achaeans against the Aetolians and the Spartans. It's sort of used, I think, to underline the bigger idea of a unified war, because with this war, the first war, Peloponnese sort of became unified. And Polybios was from Megalopolis, an Achaean statesman. So as far as I can see, he's using that local event to sort of underline his bigger idea of the interconnection of the whole world, which is quite interesting, and which is a study I would like to do at some point, I think, because I think there's really something there. In trying to understand the rise of Rome, Polybios was faced with the question how to construct a historiographical approach with the right perspective that could encapsulate the fact that events occurring in different places in the world were interconnected. To solve the issue, Polybios applied the idea of symploqué, these interconnections, which is, I think, the cornerstone in his historiography. Two passages from the introduction, we see this perspective on the world. He's using the shortcomings of monographic historians, sort of argue that early accounts were too focused on particular events and isolated studies. Only a universal perspective had the scale to show these interconnections and the interconnectedness of different events interrelated in time and space. And this was a fact that made the achievement of Polybios stand out from the rest. He sort of understood the concept in the way as when you weave a fabric going back and forth between events from different geographical regions. And it contained an organizing principle made for historians who regarded the world as a unified whole. It was perfectly suited for grand-scale narratives that were to cover a wide span of areas, because it could emphasize that the world was an organic unity. It is in this framework, I think, that we should see Polybios' polemic against other historians. They chose the wrong approach and paid the ultimate price of not seeing events in the right nexus. So narrative structure and historical understanding were closely bound up with each other, according to Polybios. And this is also where we see this double vision that I was talking about in my introduction, that he's sort of viewing his own work inside a broader framework, aligning himself with already established conventions and traditions, which is universal history, which is sort of going back to Ephorus in the 4th century. But at the same time, he's sort of creating a new historiographical position in opposition to all his predecessors. This all sounds, I think, quite pragmatic and rational. So it may be a surprise to find that his universal outlook was sort of tied to the force of emotions, because emotions could serve as links tying separate events together into an interconnected narrative. For example, in the way that he justified human decision-making. And this is where we come to the Second Punic War and the causes to the Second Punic War. First-class example of this is his treatment of the Second Punic War. The war itself was fought between 218 and 201, between Rome and Carthage. It was a turning point in world history, as it marked Rome's emergence as the dominant power in the Greco-Roman world. While Hannibal's invasion of Italy exposed many Roman problems, Rome's decisive victory shifted the balance of power decisively in Rome's favor. And the war set Rome on a path toward empire and long-term Mediterranean expansion. The picture you see, painting from the Battle of Zama, the last big battle between Carthage and Rome, between Scipio and Hannibal in North Africa, which is obviously ending with a massive Roman victory. Our interest here is not the war itself, but his considerations on the outbreak of the war. And this very detailed discussion is found in Book 3 and covers almost 30 sections. And I think I have something over here on the slide here. I think it illuminates several important things. Why universal history was superior to monographic writing. how different wars were connected to early events, and 3, how the driving forces of history was grounded in emotions, motivations, and judgment of the involved parts. So let's look at the courses that he's sort of presenting in Book 3. He famously identified 3 causes of the Second Punic War: Hamilcar's discontent with the ending of the First Punic War, the Roman takeover of Sardinia and the tribute imposed on Carthage, and Carthage's confidence in the strength in Spain. And let's look more into these 3 causes. The first cause was Hamilcar's passion, which here points to his courage and determination. Polybios does not condemn his emotional state, rather he highlights Hamilcar's achievements, making it quite clear that his passion was justified as a driving force behind the Second Punic War. The second cause was the Roman takeover of Sardinia and the additional tribute on Carthage following the First Punic War. Here, anger in response to Roman actions became collective among the Carthaginians. Combined with Hamilcar's personal desire for revenge, it all functioned as a justifiable cause of war. The third cause, according to Polybios, was the Carthaginians' growing confidence in their strength in Spain. Although Carthage was compelled to delay its response to Rome's takeover of Sardinia, it allowed them to build up military power and resources, preparing for future counterattack. He concluded his long discussion by summarizing his own opinion. The Carthaginians did take the first step with the attack in Spain, but they did so on justifiable anger. This was due to the First Punic War, the tribute imposed after the First Punic War, and the Roman takeover of Sardinia. But how are emotions, causation, and universalism connected to all this? First, I think one should note the striking similarities to Thucydides. Thucydides argued in the 5th century that the true cause of the Peloponnesian War was the steady growth of Athenian power and the fear this created in Sparta, and not the immediate events leading up to the outbreak. This framework of distinguishing between pretext and true causes is reapplied in Polybios. Hannibal's attack on Saguntum in Spain and the Roman diplomatic demands were pretext, while the real cause are found in human nature and instinct. Carthaginian resentment, humiliation, and loss leading to a justified military reaction. Second, Polybios positioned his account in contrast to early historians, most notably the 3rd century Roman historian Fabius Pictor. According to Polybios, Pictor mistakenly argued that Hannibal's ambition and lust for power were the cause, while Polybios himself argued that the true driving force was in fact justifiable anger. For Polybios, anger accounted for why Hamilcar enforced Carthage's position in Spain, and why both he and his son Hannibal received the support of the Carthaginians. Anger served to unify the state of Carthage. It also connected the Second Punic War with the first, of creating a sense of continuity, and offered a clear model of how to understand decisions of Hamilcar and Hannibal, and throughout emotions are portrayed as rational and rooted in notions of honor and justice. And then the third point. Some scholars have argued that this wrath of Hamilcar and Hannibal was a mistake by Polybios because it was too emotional, and it was maybe also a late invention. How did, for example, anger transfer from one person to another? In this case, from the father to the son. As Polybios himself knows, Hamilcar had been dead for a decade when we have the outbreak of the Second Punic War. We do have an example, actually, of how he saw this transfer, and that is in the famous oath scene where Hamilcar passed all his hate to his son Hannibal. We read in Polybios that Hamilcar brought Hannibal to the altar and had him to swear that he would forever hate the Romans. Hannibal retold this story as an old man after Carthage's defeat at Zama, and the fact that it remained with him until the end underline how deeply it may have shaped his character. And we can add, based on Polybios' second course, that while the Carthaginians did not receive this personal passion, they must have shared the fear. So, whether or not this was all invented by Polybios, it's important that this passion served as the link between two events, two wars, celebrated by decades and different persons. In a way, as the American historian Donald Kagan has observed, it resembles the situation between the First and the Second World War in the 20th century, where resentment from the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles carried over and maybe with the cause of the outbreak of the Second World War. So it underlines, all this underlines that Polybios' conception of universal history depended on long-term causal interconnections. One last example from Polybios before we move to the second part of my lecture. And this is Polybios' theory of anarchyclus, is this idea of constitutional change. It's a great example, like the Second Punic War, of how emotions and universalism and causation sort of is linked together, or linked together. In Book 6, he develops this theory on the cycle of constitutional change. Because it was rooted in human nature, and human nature across time and space actually, and had a predictive power, it was deeply tied to his concept of universal history. There's a Greek historian writing in Rome. He was from Megalopolis, but he wrote his work in Rome. This is also a really good example of how Greek ideas and distinctions could be applied on a Roman reality. He described this sequence in several steps, operating with three basic forms of government and its flawed counterparts. The driving force in the cycle is the people's emotional reactions to those ambitious persons that took power unjustified. It began in a state of nature, where emotion guided humans into distinguishing their behavior from that of animals. Indignation at the harm of others motivated people to sort of strive for justice, creating a sense of group identity. Then the community then selected the most capable person for leadership. But when the ruler began to follow his personal desires, kingship quickly degenerated into tyranny. Resentment, indignation, hatred arose against these tyrants, and the people, led by the nobles and the bravest, acted upon these emotions to establish the aristocracy. Over time, however, the aristocrats passed power to their sons, and like the tyrants, they began to pursue private interest and became oligarchs. Once more, resentment, hatred, and anger among the people created actions supported by the wider community. And these emotional reactions eventually gave rise to democracy, which began on a firm foundation that all people would rule and consider the public good. But again, ambitious politicians soon corrupted the people. But here's a difference. Instead of reacting based on social rules and moral principles, the people's own thirst for personal gain made them equally corrupt. The people could not rule themselves. And in this chaotic mob rule, this autocratia, a new leader emerged, chosen for his animal-like instincts rather than virtuous emotions, leading to a complete collapse of the political state and the rise of a one-man rule, starting the cycle all over again. How is this connected to emotions and causation and universality? Polybios linked proper emotional responses to the process of political change. Resentment, hatred, anger, and indignation served as the driving forces whenever rulers such as tyrants acted against the principles by which they had originally gained power. So the emphasis is on collective emotion, since it was those uncorrupted who provided the foundation for social transformation. Guided by a morally and rationally funded emotion, they reshaped the structure of the state, determining how they wanted to be governed. And actually even the superior balanced Roman constitution that he's treating sort of as an appendix after this theory could not escape these forces of human nature. While there was checks and balances in the mixed constitution, such as fear, which restrained the people's senate and consuls from sort of exceeding their powers, slowed the cycle, it followed the same process. It was again the descendants of good people that would at some point develop unhealthy desires for offices and honors. So to end this first part on Polybios, in both examples, in the Second Punic War and in the Anarchiclusis, passions are rational and justified and tied to Polybios' wider concept of universal history. Carthage reacted with proper emotions in their response to Roman injustice, and their anger followed the same paradigm as we just saw in the cycle. And applied in historiography, both examples force the audience to emphasize or share emotions with the characters, and it sort of invited them to model their own reactions to similar behavior. And on this final note on moral didacticism, I will now move to the second part of my talk. Which is about biography and the peripatetics. So I want to connect some of these ideas on emotion and didacticism to how biographical writing were conceived and shaped in the early Hellenistic period. And this development is very much connected to Aristotle and the first generation of the peripatetic school. As these first biographers made great use of anecdote, emotional description, and the portrayal of changing character, they resemble, I think, some of the ways in which historiographers were applying effective strategies to engage the reader. They all aim to arouse emotions and empathy through the actions of individuals by making the protagonist control the emotions of the audience. Unfortunately, while the peripatetic school was one of the most influential philosophical schools, it's also the most poorly documented. Although we have surviving work from Aristotle and Theophrastus, nothing has come down to us complete. Between Xenophon and Cornelius Nepos, the 4th century to the 1st century, we don't have any biographical works surviving. So this means that the possibility of assessing lost works depend on the number of surviving cover text and the length of the quotations or paraphrases. So what we're examining here is in this extremely fragmented landscape, is philosophical creativity, invention, and innovation on one hand, and then the notion of core teachings and canonization on the other. Before we look at specific authors, I want to take my starting point again in Polybios, in which he reflects on the relation between history and biographical writing. As we've just seen, Polybios provides an excellent opportunity to examining how authors could participate in and innovate the prose forms. In Book 10 from Polybios, he narrates Philopoemen's service as Hippocrates of the Achaean League. Here he avoided to provide a full examination of his life, as he had already written a monograph in 3 books in which he deals with his training, upbringing, and family. He then stated afterwards that he would instead discuss his deeds, for this would preserve the proper character of each work. And I think this passage deserves crucial attention for at least 2 reasons. First, what Polybios is stating about the relation between history and biography, and this is connected to the term egomiastikos. And then the second point is his focus on didacticism. Polybios' use of egomiastikos defined the nature of his monographic work, meaning something being encomiastic in nature. He argued that to preserve the proper character, the author must concentrate on family, training, and youthful ambitions, and only describe the most famous actions. In universal history, this was different. Here the peak years should be most important and receive more detailed treatment. But this could sound two completely different genres. What I think Polybios is doing is, in fact, he's stating that he would have described Philopoemen's personal background in greater detail had he not already published his monograph. So he's not saying that biographical narratives do not belong in historical works. He's pointing out that these descriptions were essential within the limits of his universal history. And he do it actually himself in many books. Books 4 and 5 on Philip II, Book 9 on Hannibal, and Book 10 on Scipio. The second point about his didacticism, he considered these portraits vital to create models for imitation, for the purpose of improving the audience. They were directly connected to this was directly connected to the moral aim of improvement, and consequently should be regarded as specific objects of imitation by aspiring statesmen. The point is here that history and biography were not sort of two different things. It was completely, deeply connected and intertwined. The lines between them were not sharp, as biography could take over many of the historiographical forms. And I think an author would choose among a multitude of forms and possibilities that were best suited to the purpose. And I think in this, a more thorough understanding of biography as a literary form has the potential to shed light on the changing Greek attitudes about the role of the individual in historiography. Fortunately, but perhaps not surprising, it is widely debated in scholarship where we should locate the beginning of formalized biographical activity. And here you have a few examples to provide some context. In one fundamental study from 1901, Frederick Leo found that Suetonius and Plutarch represented two types of biography that were the endpoints of different biographical strands originating in the 4th century. In 1956, an equally important study by Albrecht Diele argued that Socrates was the personality needed for the biography. He found that Plato, in his portrait of Socrates, created the seed from which a distinct approach could emerge. In the more recent decades, Arnoldo Magano, among others, have argued that biography has its origin in 5th century historiography, and that no direct influence of Aristotelian philosophy can be detected. My own view is that the earliest peripatetics reshaped this practice, biographical practice. In this process formulated an innovative, artful, and distinct approach. And I think in this process they connected themselves to some wider trends in historiography, ideas of narrative structure, moral analysis, attention to causality, and the emotional appeal to audiences. And I think some support can be found in this quote from St. Jerome's Compendium on Illustrious Men, written in the 4th century AD. Here, Jerome honors his great predecessor in the biographical undertaking, Suetonius. But following Suetonius, Jerome then lists the names of those who did the same thing among the Greeks. And that is Amippos, Antigonos, the learned Satyros, and the most learned of them all, Aristophanes, the musician. All these authors were connected to the peripatetic school, which suggests that some concepts and ideas from the Aristotelian framework played a decisive role in shaping this form of writing. So I want now to, only very briefly, to show a few examples from Aristophanes, Amippos, and then one author not mentioned here, Dikaiakos. So the first one is Aristophanes. He flourished in the first generation of the peripatetics, that is the end of the 4th century. From the sources we learn that he was disappointed in 322 when Theophrastus took over the school. This means that he probably was in the inner circle at this time. Of his fragments, we have fragments from some of his lives of Pythagoras, Socrates, and Plato, among others. And the works had a good reputation as they were placed by Plutarch in the company of Herodotus, Xenophon, Homer, and Aristotle. All the fragments taken together leave the impression that these biographies described the persons from life to death, in which there was a great concern for chronology. And the narrative was often organized around travels. For example, we hear of Pythagoras' travels to Delphi, Babylon, and Italy. And this brought persons into contact with various teachers, and it may have started this trend that we can see sort of began here, where intellectuals were connected to the teachers to explain the origin of philosophical doctrines. An important dimension traceable in the fragments is the aim of combining emotional descriptions and this with historical material. In some fragments, especially those on Pythagoras and his followers, focus on virtue, pity, and the effects of life. One example is from the Neoplatonic philosopher Iamblichus. We only have a small extract here, but it was too long to sort of put on a slide. But I think this is perfectly fine. The passage recounts a story about the followers of Pythagoras, a philosophical community admired for their ethical discipline and loyalty. According to Aristophanes, they maintained extraordinary friendship and devotion across generations. The story centers on two young disciples who represent this commitment by acting as protectors of each other's life, even under the threat of death. What is striking is the focus on emotional restraint. They deliberately avoided outward displays of grief in accordance with their philosophy. And the narrative sort of generated emotional responses in the audience, such as admiration and ethical reflection, because the characters' behavior contrasted with the sort of life-threatening circumstances. Another example of this is Dikaiakos. He's also from the first generation, from the school, and he's first and foremost known for massive cultural history concerns the life of Greece, focusing on the customs, manners, and character of the Greek people. This is where we have most of the material. His biographical works included treatments of Plato, Pythagoras, and Socrates, and the fragments appear to span the whole of a life cycle. Extended descriptions of the person's political careers, references to the death of Pythagoras and Socrates, and also a discussion of Plato's life, students, teachings, and literary output. Several fragments suggest that he included affective detail, how people felt, reacted, or were influenced by passion. And this style is repeatedly described by later ancient authors as his style is described as vivid and moralizing. One such example is preserved in the writings of Athenaeus and Plutarch. And here Dikaiakos describes a public scene during a festival in 325, during the campaign of Alexander the Great. The young Persian eunuch Bagoas, a favorite of Alexander, was performing in a play and he won a competition. As he passed by Alexander, the king cheered on him and kissed him. The key part of the fragment details the collective reaction of Alexander's soldiers who were present. They burst into loud applause and enthusiastic shouting, sharing the pleasure of the moment. The setting of a theatrical performance emphasized the performative nature of the emotions displayed, perhaps to stress what the reader should likely feel, such as surprise, discomfort, or even curiosity. Final example. Final author I want to include is Hermippos, active in the second half of the 3rd century. We have fragments from what appear to have been full-scale biographies, some of them in several books on the lives of Pythagoras, Gorgias, Socrates, Aristotle, and Theophrastus. And his style seems to have been colorful, as for example when he was describing death scenes. In one example, Hermippos reports a dramatic version of Demosthenes' death. According to this account, Demosthenes took poison the sanctuary and died quickly after. But as he was dying, one of the soldiers mocked him about his past speeches. Demosthenes responded with calmness that the soldier's mockery was a poor reward for the services he had given to Athens. Immediately afterwards, he died. Amippos is here mixing heroism and dignity. By using the temple setting, I think, which resembles an offering, he perhaps aimed to evoke the admiration in the audience. I think a description like this may be the reason why so many of his death scenes were quoted by later authors. We have lots of these scenes from Amippos in later material. Now, one final example. Amippos narrates the story about Pythagoras pretending to travel to the underworld. When he finally came back, people were deeply moved by his appearance and his story. They cried, believed he was divine, and even considered sending their wives to learn his doctrines. This fear and wonder circulating among the crowd in the story could be used to show how the reader should judge him and maybe also make the story more convincing. So let me, I think, end with some conclusions. So the shaping and formalization of biographical writing in the Hellenistic period was dominated by authors having some connection to the peripatetic school. Although some of these lines of development are only traceable indirectly, some concepts and approaches were framed in the broad category of historiography. The basic interest in treating a whole life, the practical and moral evaluation of the achievements, the use of anecdotes to illustrate character, and the praise and blame used to craft detailed portraits. I think this development cannot be understood without reference to its origin in philosophical and ethical preoccupations. For example, the fundamental distinction we can trace between physis, the unchangeable aspect, and ethos, that which is shaped and revealed by actions, stems from Aristotle. A person is born with certain tendencies which may develop, diminish, or conceal, but not fundamentally change or eradicate. Like historiographers could focus on positive emotions, the vividness and the emotional arousal of the audience, so too could these authors of individual lives give the reader a sense of how it would have been to be there. This was profoundly didactic at its core, I think. Fictive narrative should serve to teach moral and practical lessons through example. And I think in this light it was not a coincidence that Aristophanes, Dikaiakos, and Amippos were connected to the Aristotelian framework. After all, it was actually the only philosophical school with real interest in historical writing. So in all this, they had common goals with Hellenistic historiographers. Most notably, I think perhaps with historians such as Theopompus, Euonymus, Douis, and Philakos, who we know actually included more dramatic and emotional scenes that we see in Polybios, but they are unfortunately extremely fragmented. But I think Polybios could do the same. For example, in his retelling of fear, despair and suffering in the destruction of Carthage in 146. This is where we have this story about Scipio in tears, watching the burning of Carthage. He puts forth this possibility that Rome sort of will suffer the same fate in the future, sort of inside the same framework. And as we saw, Polybios could use anger, resentment to explain why Rome and Carthage ended up in a global conflict that changed the surface of the world, or how reactive emotions could cause constitutional changes. So to conclude, Polybios argued that historians had to apply the force of exemplarity, showing the audience how passion could explain causation and shape the destinies of states and individuals. I think in both historiography and biography, this grew from reflecting on the successes and failures of others, because proper emotional responses were most effectively examined through the lives of generals, statesmen, and philosophers. Thanks for your attention.